more available and bite-sized for y'all.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellie, and welcome, y'all. It's great to see so many people joining. My name is Elizabeth Atwell, and as Ellie just described, this training today has been a long time in the making. It is building off of years of research and implementation. The training today is funded through Well Center's 2020 USDA Local Food Promotion Programs Grant. And developing this value chain coordination training curriculum is a cornerstone of that project. And we are so jazzed to be working with Sarah Rocker and Elliot Smith to both lead the development and the delivery of the first ever value chain coordination training of this kind. But we all probably know that just going to a training isn't usually quite enough for you to be like, all right, got it from here, bring it on. New questions and opportunities and challenges are constantly arising, especially today. And we need the support of peers, and we need resources and continuing learning all the time. So there are a couple other opportunities through the same project that is funding this training that I want to tell y'all about. So backing up real quick, as Ellie mentioned, the Wallace Center is the backbone organization for the Food Systems Leadership Network, which is a national network of people and organizations that are working to build equitable community power, connection, and resiliency through food and farming systems. And Ellie, if you will drop the link in there to the platform for the Food Systems Leadership Network, you can learn a lot more and plug into the network there. So through the FSLN, we recently launched a national value chain coordination community of practice just this past August. And this community of practice is a place to build relationships with peers who are doing this work across the country, to learn about innovations, learn about best practices, share about your own work, and work with a lot of other awesome people to just solve common challenges. So we have a monthly call series for that, and we'll also drop the registration link in. So far, we've covered topics like what exactly is value chain coordination? How do you communicate the impact of VCC work and get it funded? Our last call in October was about understanding and responding to the supply chain disruptions happening across the country. So our next call is going to be on Tuesday, November the 16th at 3 p.m. And please sign up and join. It's a great way to build upon the learning of this training and form friendships with other people doing this work. And we'll drop into the chat here a link to the discussion group, which kind of serves as a listserv for this community of practice, as well as a value chain coordination resource library on the Food Systems Leadership Network platform. One other thing I want to mention is, as Sarah and Elliot are going to get into at some length, value chain coordination is really complex. It consists of lots of different types of activities and can vary a lot depending on where the person practicing value chain coordination is located, if you're in a nonprofit, if you're in a food hub. Because of this, measuring and communicating the impacts of value chain coordination is pretty complicated. It's also really important to be able to do when we communicate the impacts of this role to change makers and funders. This is how we get this funded, continued, and are able to accelerate the impacts of this work. So through this same project, the Wallace Center is working with Dawn Thilmany of Colorado State University, Sarah Rocker, and an awesome group of advisors and practitioners to develop an impact evaluation framework for value chain coordination. We're going to pilot this early next year, so there's more to come. Just want that to kind of be on your radar. And then finally, the training today is just the second delivery of this material. The first having happened a few days ago in Hawaii, which incidentally is where Sarah and Elliot are right now. These live deliveries are what we're calling the kind of the short course of this training, just because we can't keep you here for 18 hours. But we are doing an online longer version of this same material as a kind of e-learning course. It's going to start early next year. So knowing that this is just the second delivery, knowing that of course it's not perfect, we really, really need your feedback. We're really trying to learn and make this better all the time. So we're of course going to follow up with some evaluation. We really want to hear from you what worked, what didn't. And we'll also send follow-up information about everything I've mentioned today, the discussion group, the community practice, all of that, as well as the longer form version of this course online next year. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our amazing presenters, Sarah Rocker and Elliott Smith, to introduce themselves and get things started.
Thank you so much, Ellie and Elizabeth, and good morning. Sorry, it's morning for us. As Ellie said, just turned 7 a.m. out here in Kona. We're in Hawaii, actually on a farm. We're out here doing some value chain coordination work. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And if you hadn't already seen the message because we are such a big group today, and we actually have even more than we thought were coming, the best way for us to do introductions is in the chat. Please let us know who you are by sharing your name, your organization, and the region you're from. That's really helpful. We will have time for a little bit of breakout today and a lot more tomorrow, sort of more interaction. But today is going to be, imagine sort of like taking a 101 value chain history college course. And we promise we don't want you to fall asleep. So we will be teachers that help to try to keep you engaged. We would like to just do a couple of housekeeping things. If you have a question, chat is one way to do it. Another way is to use the raise your hand feature so that we can call on you. With a group this size, we can't just have people unmiking. So either chat or an analog hand or a digital hand would be ways to do that. One other way that we can communicate is if you go to the ellipses next to your name, you could be able to rename yourself, and you're also welcome to put your organization or your state abbreviation in there as well. It just really helps us like a virtual name tag when we're in a group this size. So that's it for some of the housekeeping. I'd like to also just say a little bit about who we are and how it is that we are speaking to you today. So my name is Sarah Rocker. I'm a trained rural sociologist, and currently I work as a private consultant in food systems. I'm joined by
Elliott Smith. That's my name. I'm with the group Kitchen Sink Strategies, my company. Similarly, background in value chain work and doing consulting work, as well as brokerage for small farmers selling to institutions these days.
And the reason that Elliott and I are working together is, as Ellie and Elizabeth have indicated, we're all part of this larger project with the Wallace Center that is a USDA local food promotion program grant to essentially develop the best practices and trainings of what we know about the work of value chain coordination, what's worked so far, what's kind of nascent and on the cutting edge, and to just share that with you. So as they mentioned before, my work with Wallace has gone since, and value chain coordination as a researcher has started back in 2015, 2016, when I did my doctoral dissertation on this work and the Food Link project, which Ellie gave a really lovely sort of high level synopsis of that. We're going to actually do a little bit of deep dive into that history today, just so that we're all on the same page about where the interest in VCC has been, and bring us all on the same page around some common language. So I think without further ado, we're going to jump right in. So this first little part is our first little lecture on breaking it down of what is a value chain. And sorry, this is our piece here of, if we have more time, we'll be doing this. This is what's in the chat. So here we are. It's bright and early over here, bright and afternoony over there. A value chain is ... Where does your mind go? Okay, so just letting that sit in for a moment. Historically, Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School was one of the first to bring the concept of value chain into the canon, at least in the United States. And at its very basic core, Michael Porter was suggesting that a value chain is really just a set of interrelated processes that create added value. In this case, dollar signs were a really big piece of what Michael was talking about. To illustrate this point, here's the journey from some wheat to bread. In Porter's concept here, every time the wheat went through a transformational process, more value was created to this product, right? So raw wheat is not as valuable as when it's milled. And when it gets baked, there's even more value added to the original product. And when it gets packaged and distributed, there's even more value. And Porter was suggesting that when you can sort of recognize that way that value gets added, and you can have all of these activities under one roof, that creates an amazing competitive advantage for a particular business over another. So this is some original history here. Now, the local and regional food systems movement, very different than the business school sort of academia literature, also started talking about value chains. And they were thinking, not only can this be a strategy that a single business use, but what if all those added processes happened among different players along the supply chain? What if, for example, the farmer did the first linkage of producing, then the link to the miller with the processing, then the baker, and so on. And in this manner, businesses can work together collaboratively to increase value for themselves and for each other. And so you can think about this in some other sort of fancy terms here from academic literature that can just kind of be insightful for us. You might think about this as being successful by cooperating with your competitors, or success through co-opetition, as some say. Another way to look at this is that sort of the rising tide lifts all ships. By this collaboration, it's creating added value for everybody, and you can't do it alone because you don't have that ability to do those processes alone. Another nuance of the definition here is around this idea that these agreements and how folks find partnerships in each other can be based on shared values. So it's not just, I'm a farmer and I'm looking for any old miller. I'm a miller and I'm looking for any old baker. Oftentimes, others have suggested that the way that collaboration is formed is through first identifying shared common values, such as social values or environmental or cultural or quality values around the product. And in the bottom corner here, it's just an example of a few that have been used and maybe that you might even use in your work. So farmers and processors and retailers that all care about, for example, local or regionality or a heritage variety or labeling such as organic or fair. Those are ways that folks find each other in the food system. In this kind of articulation and this sort of nuance or spin on the definition of a values-based supply chain, there's also a fundamental difference about the way that these businesses communicate with each other. And different than sort of traditional arm's length supply chain, which is all about price generally, and where there isn't a lot of transparency in who's buying and selling to whom, in a values-based model, there's transparency from the suppliers to the buyers, and there's a more concerted effort to share and mitigate risk and also share profits. This is a fundamental different way of relating to each other in the supply chain. So here's an interesting sort of piece that came out in 2011. Again, this is our little history. This is our sort of college course 101 here. So we're going through a lot of literature first, and then we'll have time to unpack it. Michael Porter came back around, the original guy from 1985, and wrote a piece with Kramer in a business journal on this new concept for him of shared value chain. So he was like, oh, maybe there is something beyond just doing this and having one business have competitive advantage over another. Even now in the business world, they're talking about this. So not just in the food world, that shared value chains are, again, this kind of more relational focused dynamic between suppliers and buyers. And it's this collaborative reconceiving of how to create products, how to get them to markets, how to do it within local regional clusters. And the really big thing that Michael Porter is now talking about in this shared value chain definition is that you can also address social and cultural and environmental needs while making a profit. You all are probably like, gosh, business school, we've been doing this for decades, catch up. But just want to let you know, even in the business world, they're talking about this, not just the food world. Also, in the broader rural development world, so this is not just about food, but in like rural and place-based economic development, some of the work out of Yellowwood Associates and the Aspen Institute have been talking about a slightly different spin on this. And this is the idea of wealth creating value chains. And I have here their definition here of a sort of network of people and businesses and organizations and agencies. So not just people in the transaction, but also all these support sort of actors addressing market opportunities to meet demands. But the real interesting thing about this definition here is that it's really focused on building local and regional wealth. So this is a really special kind of definition that they articulate, because a lot of the other ones necessarily don't talk about we're creating wealth and we want it to stick. It's this, and this definition of wealth works is really all about how can folks in a single region come together, identify a demand, meet it, and then try to make that wealth stay in their region. So, woo, there's a lot. We've got one more, and then we're gonna break this all down and have a chat about it. The last definition that I want to share with you is one that I think is really important, and it's because this is where our partners at the USDA also are articulating and talking about food value chains. And why is that important? Well, the USDA holds a lot of power, including setting policy and also funding for this work. So it's really important to understand where they've been in understanding what food value chains mean, so that when we're applying for grants, we know the language that's being understood. In the USDA, in this particular piece on food value chains, they really had a definition that understood that this strategy was important, especially for small and mid-scale producers. So those that were too big for direct markets, but not big enough for commodity markets, who had a specialty product. So this works especially well when you're not just trying to sell commodity apples, but when there's something special about that apple, or there's something special about that wheat. And you can see here their definition also takes into account some of the shared values as well. So, but a really important focus here on differentiated non-commodity products and for small and mid-scale producers. Woo, let's sit back for a minute. That was probably more than you bargained for in the beginning of this training, of this two-day training. But we're going to sit back for a second here, and we're going to reflect on all of these different kinds of articulations of the definitions of value chain that are out there. And the reason we're going to do this is because we would like to suggest that there hasn't been, to this point, a very good canonization. There's been a lot of different sort of nuances and spins on this terminology. And there's some things that these terms have in common, which is that it's different than traditional supply chain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what I want you to do right now is thinking about all these definitions for yourself. And you can write this in the chat. You can write sort of the number. This is one way to do this, is to think about how do these definitions resonate with your work? So, for example, I don't know if we can. For example, if one of these has been your number one go-to, could you just write number 4 in the chat box to say, oh yes, values-based supply chain, that's the one I've been using. Or if it's been more of a focus on local and regional, put in number 6. We just like to kind of get a sense here, or maybe it's multiple. Maybe you're like, oh, I think I kind of resonate with number 2 and number 5. If you can just start to kind of write in the chat, that would be helpful. And we're also going to, for sake of time, we were thinking of breaking out, but I think we're going to do the raise hands here. If you'd like to also say your response of like what you're thinking, put your hand up, and we're going to open this up for a little bit of a discussion right now. So 2 ways to participate: 1 in the chat, 2 in through the mic. And I actually forgot to mention a very important thing when we first started. We are a video, this is a pro video session. Because this session, it really relies a lot on us making eye contact with you. And this is not sort of just a lecture, this is a workshop. So if you have that capability, and I apologize for not making that announcement before, we invite you to turn your video on, because that really just helps us as facilitators connect. And also we can sometimes read the confused eyebrow, like, so I'd like to invite anyone from the group now to just come off mute And we would like to just have a little bit of a unpacking. Did you even know that there were this many definitions of value chains? And what's resonating with you? And we can also just be looking at how the votes are coming in as well.
Lots of 5, lots of 6.
I'm going to call on someone just because facilitators privileges. Karen, thank you. Susan, you'll be up next.
You're most
Karen,
welcome. I concentrate on 5 and 6 because I have a feeling that if we wait for the American consumer to fully appreciate organic and made with love products, which many in this value food system are part of, which is a wonderful thing to be part of. We might not really get good food to many people. So I like 5 and 6 because they really focus on understandable values of producing a good product, getting it through a reliable chain. Reliability and quality obviously should remain part of everybody's decision, but that this is an option for wealth building and expansion of farming that is sustainable and helpful to the consumer.
thank you so much. Susan, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, I just thought it was interesting. There are several of us from the same area on this call, and we all answered that question differently. And it depends, I think it depends on where specifically we are working in the food system. Was our perspective on how we answered that question. I also think that there's a bit of difference on where folks are going to be working on that, on how this resonates with your work, depending upon your cultural background. So for some areas, you know, with some cultures, there's going to be a lot of value placed on the social outputs as compared to anything else, to build a value chain around food.
That's a really, a couple of really insightful things in there, Susan. The first being that some of you from the same sort of area of work are here and have different definitions. And I think to your point there, that's one reason that we want to kick this training off with naming that there are different interpretations of this work. And it's not to necessarily overwhelm, it's to raise awareness. In some ways, I think that the concept of value chain has been used as a big tent concept, somewhat like maybe other big tent concepts like local or sustainable. There's power in the big tent, but also there's nuance in the big tent. And so one thing that we're just hoping, if you take nothing else away from this training, is to be more aware of some of the nuance and feel free to borrow from what's been written about before and adapt, as you say, to the context that you're working with in that region, or maybe in that time, or maybe with that particular project. And I can't answer the question of whether or not there will be at one point one definition to rule them all. I'm not sure if that's going to serve us, but I do think having this conversation is a great place to start.
Hi, Sarah.
So we're gonna, is that Brian? Brian.
Yeah. Hi.
Chime in.
I was just wanted to point out behind what Susan said. Also, I think depending on what our organization we come from, myself and my colleague Becky also working in food systems and extension, but both given different definition answers.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Thank you.
I just found it very interesting that you know someone else I work with has a slightly different interpretation where we see our work in value chain coordination as extension educators. So it's interesting.
Thank you, Brian. And again, we hope that this is a starting place to have conversations with your colleagues. So with that, I want to say thank you, everybody, for just listening to this very expansive first part of the conversation. Now we're going to help to bring some more sort of contraction and consensus. And I'm going to tell you not only what these definitions have sort of differently or uniquely, we're going to talk about what they have in common to help kind of bring us back together and move us forward. So with that, sit
Sarah,
back for your next.
Sarah, this is Debbie
Yeah.
Trop. I was wondering if
hi,
I could
Deb.
just, yeah, I can interject a piece of history here. I love this conversation, as you might imagine. I want to say, as someone who helped put together the food value chain definition, is that this is developed at a point in time. And I think that, so I think your point about these are dynamic, and, you know, the chronology is actually rather important, because we rooted what we did in what Michael Porter's work was in Harvard Business Review, as you well know, but also we were basing it on having looked at a number of pilot projects and trying to come up with an umbrella that wasn't so much aspirational as would function as an umbrella for the kind of projects we were seeing in some of the earlier innovations. And it wasn't until after this period that I started becoming more familiar with the wealth creation literature. And I would say that you really need a combination, this is just me, you need a combination of 5 and 6 if you're truly going to do community development, because we didn't even have a lot of the concepts about how do you give back to the community that's really packed into the wealth creation literature. That wasn't even on our radar screen when we were developing the food value chains. We did care about shared value, operational value, and sort of philosophical principles among the practitioners, but we weren't thinking more broadly than that network. So I just wanted to point that out and own the limitations of our own definition.
Wow, Deb, I want to thank you. I didn't want to put you on the spot or say that we had a co-author in the room, but thank you for sharing that. Deb Trop, formerly of USDA Rural Development and co-author of the number 5 definition. Thank you for sharing that, Deb.
Sure.
So classes are going to resume here just for a little bit. I'm going to put my lecturer hat on here. And we're going to just have a little bit of a geeky moment about value chain thinking versus supply chain thinking. We won't go too in depth here, so I don't want you to get overwhelmed, but this is another important piece of history of why we talk about value chains in contrast to what. So I'd like to just say that this is a model of some different sort of kinds of relationships in supply chain and business literature. And here in the brackets, value chain strategy is sort of everything in the green. It's really about this fundamental way of doing business that's based on partnerships in the cooperative, coordinated, and collaborative buckets, with an emphasis on the relationships being primarily what sort of motivates and drives the work. This is in contrast to, you might have heard this term before, arm's length, keeping people at an arm's length distance, adversarial systems and transactional contracts, oftentimes in which buyers and suppliers don't know each other, or the emphasis is on price. So this is what all of those definitions have in common, is that they are a response to this former supply chain strategy. I'm going to share one other little sort of piece here from some supply chain literature. Now, this is a little bit of a matrix, but this is how we start to talk about a really important element, not just in value chain coordination, but in food systems work in general, which is the concept of power and who has it and who doesn't. And from this sort of historical piece here, I'd like to show you that in this X and Y axis, or the vertical axis here, we have 6 different kinds of relationship structures that one can have with buyers and suppliers. On the vertical axis, there's power. At the top, buyers have dominance, and at the bottom, suppliers have dominance. On the the horizontal axis here, we have collaboration, low to high. And here is the sweet spot of where the value chain strategy works. It's a symmetrical power relationship in which power is shared. So the buyers aren't dominant and the suppliers aren't dominant. It's a shared structure in which collaboration is high. And all of the 5 other boxes are different ways that supply chain literature sort of names what happens when there is a power imbalance or when collaboration just isn't present. So we could talk at length, and there's probably, as you can see here, a lot more reading that could be done on this, but I just want to give you the big picture about sort of the relationship dynamics of how value chain strategy is different than arm's length strategy. So let's talk a little bit also about power and what supply chain strategy historically, where that power historically existed, and what the value chain strategy is attempting to do. So in a traditional supply chain, most often the power concentration was in the middle with processors and distributors. So some of those really large buyers in the green. Where it wasn't, in particular, was with the initial producers, and some might argue consumers, although I think that's changing today a little bit more. Value chain strategy, and most of these definitions and what we think they have in common, is that they are fundamentally about shifting power across this chain structure so that there is this equitable distribution, good communication, sharing risk, profits among all of the actors in the supply chain, including the farmer. If you ask most people who do value chain coordination work, who's your primary stakeholder that you're concerned about? 9 times out of 10, it's the farmer. And this is why, because historically they have been the ones in the value chain themselves that have been most marginalized. Now I'm going to shift it over to Elliot to just kind of lead us through a little bit of conversation and thinking about what we do with this awareness around power as we intentionally plan for doing value chain coordination in the future.
Right. And I'm going to go back a couple slides here just to come back to this important piece. And Deb, you kind of named a little bit of this in your point earlier, but the sweet spot that Sarah's noting here, it is a thing that we're aiming for with value chain strategy. It is in essence really an aspirational balance that I think a few of us have the pleasure of enjoying constantly in our work. Maybe it happens, you get wins every once in a while, but we're usually striving in this direction, because in this traditional way of thinking, kind of on the left column of the matrix, kind of, it's an arm wrestling match, right? In traditional supply chain thinking, there's a winner and there's a loser. And the one who wins gets what they want. The one who loses doesn't get anything that they want often. The problem, obviously, there's so many problems in that structure, but one of them is that when the focus is on price and you're doing things at an arm's length, you don't acknowledge anything but the number of the price. There is no accounting for the externalized costs of the production of the good that was purchased or the service that was purchased. There's no consideration often of the effect on the land or the impact on the community of the end consumer, or certainly even often just the impact of the immediate local economy is not a consideration. I have a hunch that most of us in this room are trying to figure out how to unfold those considerations into our own strategies and work. So in value chain strategy, to build towards this true collaboration, we're focusing on these relationships, and the understanding there is that the impact of that focus undoes what isn't considered in traditional supply chain thinking. So the impact of a value chain strategy is a food economy that is less extractive. It's less at the expense of the farmer and the lower ends of the value chain. It's less I, me, mine thinking, because I understand for my value chain strategy to flourish, my success is tied to your farmer well-being. And in that sense, value chain strategy speaks to something that's sort of philosophically, even spiritually, very different than strategic supply chain thinking. that is more about belonging and interconnectivity, interrelationships. That's the very fabric of the strategy itself. So I want to sort of open this conversation with that in mind. In my mind, and in our thinking and the work itself, value chain coordination creates this opportunity for a focus on relationships. If you are a person who is doing value chain coordination work, there is also a responsibility to focus on those relationships. And that means considering the impacts of all the rest of that work below the surface, not just your costs or your margins, but what are those multiple levels of impact? And in our sort of approach here, it is something for which value chain coordination folks have to be planning. Power is more, though, than just the sharing of information, risks, and profit. We could do a 40-hour workshop on power. So we're going to have to simplify it to some degree here. And basically, I'll lay out, I guess I'll propose that in addition to a fair distribution of the info, the risks, and the profit that value chain strategy seeks to build, let's consider power on these two sort of two levels here, one being interpersonal and institutional. There are many more for sure, but in value chain work and thinking about how to plan for power in your own work, understanding how you as one person build a relationship with one other person requires you to understand the influence that each has on the other. That's the interpersonal dynamic here. But per your point, Brian, when you show up into a room as an institution or as an entity, you have to also be very cognizant of how that entity is perceived by the other entities in the room, literally or otherwise. So basically, the proposal here is that value chain strategy requires us to be thinking in terms of power with, not power over. Being relational in its nature, we have to be considering how power is used throughout the value chain. And we'll say that, capital P power here, power with, not power over, is a core principle of a successful value chain strategy.
So with that, we're going to return back to our historical definitions and think about where is that work of creating more equity, more fair distribution of power in these definitions. And before we open up the floor, we have about 15 minutes here to have a large group discussion, which we're going to use both the chat and raising hands and some free flowing conversation. I'd like to see the idea here to build on what Elliot is suggesting, that historically, one of the main dimensions in which there was a power imbalance was where your position was in the value chain. Specifically, if you were a farmer, you typically had a less power and not as good of a position as almost everybody else. However, we recognize there are other dimensions in which people can be marginalized in this work, not least of which including their scale, their race, their gender, their language, their access to capital. And we'd like to open up the floor today for you all to talk about the dimensions of equity work that you might be on your radar currently for your current project or your current community, and just do a little bit of a reflection here about where these definitions are meeting that need and where we might need to adapt the definitions to better speak to the kind of equity work that needs to happen that maybe you all are already doing or would like to be doing in the future. And I'm going to start us out by raising up a question that already came in the chat. What efforts are taking place to support and prioritize experiential and diverse leadership? I'm actually going to let that person who's raised their hand unmute and say a little bit more about that question to kick us off into our discussion.
Hi, thank you. This is Ani. I'm going to leave my camera off for now because it's a little easier for me to speak when I'm not worried about what my face looks like. Because this is a difficult topic to talk about, and it's something that's very near and dear to like the work that I'm doing. I'm based here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is not technically the Northeast. But when we're talking about history lessons, this is right up my alley. And actually, Deb and I have had some very interesting conversations about the historical context of where I'm at right now to this work. And I'm a bit of a nerd, so apologize. But here in Fort Wayne, back in 1956, a grocery store was opened that at the time was the world's largest grocery store, Evie's grocery store. And I put this in a summary, I'll share it later, but the gentleman who opened it, Henry J. Evie, was part of the inaugural advisory committee to the USDA on like regional food systems development because of his work in this area. And now, not quite 60 years later, that store, has been gutted, and that neighborhood that grew up around it has been completely disenfranchised. And, seeing that full circle of, what was this showpiece of our country and, what is now at the heart of a community that has exceedingly high infant and maternal mortality rates because of the intentional disinvestment that has occurred in that community, to me is a unmistakable example of, where the equity and reparative value chain work needs to be done, which is that kind of combination for me of, a lot of these. It shouldn't be an either or. We should be able to do, shared value and have decent food, but it's really critical for me that we address the misinformation about the history of things and the misinterpretation and the misdefinition. That's why I avoid the term food desert. And I'm fairly adamant about the term food apartheid and intentionally making people uncomfortable because they should be uncomfortable, because we need to address the fact that this was not an accidental thing. They didn't accidentally build the world's largest grocery store and within a lifetime accidentally gut it and use the proceeds to build 2 super grocery stores in the suburbs where the residents of that initial community fled to, and the timeline, you can overlay it and it's obvious, but no one has, there's this avoidance of acknowledging, this is that, critical race, aspect of it, and really acknowledging and facing and owning the history of what has gotten us to this place. And in that sense, the experiential and lived leadership of those of us who've grown up in food insecure communities, and in that space, we know those issues instinctively and intuitively, and putting that leadership, and that's the critical thing, is putting that in leadership, because so many times diverse individuals like myself are invited to bring our experience and our insight, to support other initiatives that are led by individuals who don't have that intensity, that urgency that comes from having that lived experience and knowing what that feels like. And that's not a judgment call on, any of the, really wonderful individuals who are involved in this work everywhere. It's just an acknowledgement that, the value of that experiential perspective in guiding, these efforts. It's not something that we have to think about. It comes naturally, unfortunately. And unfortunately, we also don't do a very good job of putting that perspective in leadership and properly supporting and empowering them, which again goes to that acknowledging the history of the inequities. So I'm going to stop there. I have a little document that I put together with some links to Debbie's presentation and to some of the USDA historical documents on the Evie grocery store and whatnot. I'm happy to share that with folks and continue the conversation if anybody's interested. So thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
So we also have Leah. I apologize, Leah, for missing your comment first, but we'd like to give you a little bit of airtime to your question around how is accountability thought about for these chains? Would like to say anything more about that? And then for others, get ready. We're going to continue to open the floor for about the next 10 minutes. So please feel free to use the hand button if you'd like to be next in queue.
Sure. Hi, sorry, my video is not working, but thank you. I'm Leah Eden with Equity Advocates in New York City. And the thing that keeps coming through to me is like the critical role of trust in all of these relationships. And I'm wondering, you know, how do different individuals and organizations within these networks, you know, what are some different ways that they think about building in accountability structures, both for new value chains, but then also for ones that have more longevity to them, right? Where there's established relationships, maybe there's some difference there, but I'm just really interested in that, like, you know, there's the idealistic piece, but then also the accountability piece, and how do those kind of go hand in hand?
That's an amazing question. Would anyone else like to respond to that or offer something else up? Please unmute and feel free to take the floor.
I have a question about what you just asked. When FDA is involved in these kinds of systems, do they have local, maybe experienced farm or orchard or livestock producers as any part of an advisory board of what should be happening in that area around those issues? Is that part of FDA activity?
I think, do you mean the U.S. Department of Agriculture? I think that's what you mean.
Yeah,
US.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm aware of several actually. So there's like a small farm task force, for example, that Juliana Arnett is leading. Deb, do you know of others that that have a lot of farmer participation?
No, I'm
And Brian,
asking if when decisions are made about by the Department of Agriculture about what's going on with, hey, cherry picking and production in San Jose, California. And if they have input in terms of funding, in terms of advice or whatever, are experienced people, there are many, they're older people usually, are they involved in the discussions at that kind of a local level? Does anybody know if that ever happens?
Okay. I'm actually going to ask if you know that answer to put that in the chat. It's a little bit of something that we're not experts in, but I know there are some experts in the room who have either sat on USDA sort of panels or listening sessions. So I'm going to ask if folks could answer that question in the chat, and then we're going to let Brian respond, I think, to what Leah was just saying. So Brian, go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish I had a response for Leah, but I think she's really getting at the heart of the issue when we're talking about values-based systems and chains, that this level of accountability and the importance of trust is just so critical, often replaced by regulatory bodies, which have their own issues. But I think if we're, I mean, Sarah, you mentioned scale. I think it was more of a discriminatory factor, but you know, I think most of us here I would like for values-based systems to be the rule as opposed to the exception. But how can you do that without greater systems of accountability? Yeah, I mean, and it seems like that element of trust is so critical, yet also the most difficult element to scale. So that's just sort of one of the many things. This has been a great lesson, discussion. Really appreciate everything you guys have had to say.
Yeah, that's an amazing reflection that you have there, Brian. So that's gonna be something I'll take with me too. How do you scale trust when that's like one of the most fundamental pieces needed? I want to lift up a comment that Mike has made in the chat as well, and Mike, feel free to come off mute. We have a minute or so if you'd like to share that regarding the nuance between farmers and farm workers. There's an ownership piece there. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that conversation, Mike?
Hi, everyone. No, just that I think that, this sometimes the scale, if we're talking about like local agriculture, a lot of times it really is just, a family operation, or we're not talking about migrant and seasonal workers, but at the regional scale, you do start to talk about that, especially with dairies, which is big in the Northeast, and other things. I'm from Minnesota, so, we also have some of that, but yeah, so just including that, I think that, especially with wealth building, are we talking, I think we really do need to include farm workers and what's the path to wealth for them, and other workers, even just people working in restaurants, other food service workers, like what's the path to wealth for them in this conversation. So, but this is great. Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Thank you. So we're going to slowly start to wrap up this conversation and shift forward, but I just want to sort of say a couple of big things to put a pin in where I think we are at this moment right now. Not least of which is one other comment that came in, just talking about the importance of sort of non-human actors in the supply chain, right? So Dana's comment here around land and the amazing work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, for those who know that author, not just who are we speaking for in terms of human individuals, but who's speaking for the non-human individuals, right? So the land itself, the soil, the animals, the ecosystem. And I think that's a really interesting question. And so I just want to thank, even though Dana might not be on anymore with us, thank you for uplifting that. If we look at these definitions and start to unpack, and we didn't highlight this for you, but you can start to see in here when we look at the articulation of where equity work is sort of nestled or hiding in these definitions or located, you see some reference here, like on definition number 4 to size, right? So there's small and mid-scale was called out as like, this is a dimension in which marginalization is happening or disadvantage. The definition there for example, also number 5, the fact that they're calling out different types of actors in the value chain, like producers and buyers, means that there's an attention there that where you are in the value chain is a dimension of where marginalization can happen. And also in the definition number 6, that very last line talking about wealth being rooted in local and regional wealth, the reason that's being named is the alternative is that wealth leaves, wealth goes somewhere else, and it's being concentrated not in the community. And I think the way I'd like to sort of just wrap up this conversation and leave you all with a reflection is, as you think about what definition or definitions of this work resonate with you, how would you implicitly or explicitly state your commitment to equity, and along what dimensions? So again, we don't have time to do this. As Elliot mentioned, we could do a 40-hour training just on this talk alone. This is really meant to be sort of a primer and something that you reflect on moving forward in your work. With that being said, I'm going to open it up to another sort of icebreaker. Let's zoom out here for a moment. And let's think about, in the positive way that we think about the work and the positive change that we're trying to affect. When we see a thriving food system, what are the characteristics that make a food system thrive? So this is kind of the question that is leading us into now our second half of today. And I'd like if you could just take this to the chat, and we're going to start to unpack this. Words or phrases that come up to you when you think in your mind's eye of that is a thriving food system. What are the characteristics that are present that are making that food system thrive? And I'm going to ask Elliot to read some of them out loud as they come in, if you're willing.
I'll lead off by putting one I just heard. I feel like we're going to revisit this theme, but trust. seems important to making a thriving food system. As Karen points, experienced producers who care for the land very much. A thriving food system is one in which everyone has access to sustainable and dignified livelihoods. Yeah. Shared investment, sustainability, shared goals and values. This is all great. Distributed power, decision-making. Yeah, feel free to share more as they come to you. Strong sense of community, yeah. And processing and sales that are innovative, interesting. Yeah, we might touch on that tomorrow a little bit. Yeah, and people who are engaged with one another and involved in the system. That speaks to the relationships that some have noted. Healthy food, shared power, to create and share power, not apply it. That's awesome. And not depend on exploitation. That's great.
Mm-hmm. Spaces where food is shared and relationships are born. Oh, I love those spaces. Wonderful. Feel free to keep those coming in for a little bit, because I just think that in addition to the learning, there's also just a lot of good inspirational feelings coming through here, and we could use that. So I'd like to thank you all for sort of putting your minds to this and sharing some of the characteristics that you've seen in your work, in your professional experience, in what makes a food system thrive. I'd like to suggest that typically within the building blocks of a food system, there are sort of two main buckets. And Ellie, actually, from the Wallace Center in her introduction, started us out with this concept. So we're just going to revisit what Ellie from the Wallace Center had helped kind of lay out of the way that Wallace is thinking about this work. Most of you actually in this group, and Ellie and I've done this training before, and so it's interesting to see the mix here. Most of you are actually already in the domain that we're taking this conversation today, which is talking about the soft infrastructure. Typically, we see a little bit more of a lead in with hard infrastructure, but this is DSOG, and you guys are a thoughtful breed. So I'm just going to introduce two sort of umbrella concepts to think about all of the words and ideas that were just coming in the chat here. Hard infrastructure is the stuff that we can knock on, right? It's the stuff we can touch, see, and feel, like the aggregation and the processing facilities and the distribution points and the highways and the roads and the season extension technology like greenhouses that are really important, that if the physical stuff isn't there, there's no point, there's no way that the food and people can connect. So we know that that's important. But what is increasingly, I think the awareness that's increasingly sort of raising here is that there's this whole other dimension of soft or social infrastructure in the form of relationships and knowledge and networks that is really an incredibly necessary component that helps support the efficient use of trucks. So it doesn't really matter how expensive your new food hub is. If you don't have people who know each other and you don't have buyers who know what season things are happening in, and you don't have trust, it's not going to be very successful. And a lot of this learning was coming out in some of the conversations that USDA Rural Development and Wallace Center were having back in 2015. And I have the citation for a really awesome webinar that's back in the history books, if you guys want to go back and check it out, in which sort of these waves of food systems development have been being piloted. And I'd like to just remind us, for those that many of you are probably in this, that the first wave of a lot of regional and local food systems development work was, oh my gosh, we don't have the hard stuff, we have to build it. And thus there was this huge emphasis on things like food hubs at the time. However, after several years of investing in things like food hubs, some reports came out and some anecdotal experiential conversations happened, like on this webinar that I have referenced below, with wondering, why are some food hubs failing and others are just rocking it out? What is the difference between those that struggle and those that thrive? And the answer really was soft infrastructure. the lack of, in some cases, doing that relationship building prior to or in tandem with developing hard infrastructure. And this is where this really beautiful learning came, and it's what inspired the investment that then became the Food Link project, which Ellie from Wallace also referenced, which is this idea of, okay, how do we concertedly invest in the idea of building soft infrastructure for food systems? And I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson here on a partnership that Wallace Center and USDA Rural Development had. And if you try to find this press release anymore, the USDA website's changed, but haha, I screenshotted it in advance. So here we have this press release that came out back in 2016 that showed the initial idea of this money going to try to stimulate the building of soft infrastructure across the nation in certain select communities. And here were the communities that were selected back in 2016 with the idea that with some money and training and bring these folks together, this would be a way to infuse efforts in soft infrastructure to develop more robust regional food systems. And here's also just some promotional material from this program. So Food Link stands for leveraging investment through network coordination. And again, you can see here, this was this 3-year initiative to give training to folks on the ground who were already doing the connecting work in their community, but to give them additional money to do that connecting work, to build relationships, and also to meet other people who were doing similar kind of work around the country. And together, USDA and the Wallace Center led this work. And this is what I did my dissertation on. I got to be sort of a fly on the wall and watch this investment for the 3 years that it ran, which is how I also come to you today with the knowledge that I do. So a few interesting things to note about this initial investing in soft infrastructure was this idea that there was a single sort of coordinator or value chain coordinator model who was the link between all of the different facets in the supply chain, and they performed these very important roles at the bottom. And I just want to draw your attention to that for a few moments. The roles included doing things like market matchmaking, saying, ooh, you're a buyer, you're a supplier, you don't know each other, you should know each other. So that's a really important role that coordinators do. Another is just sometimes relationship building. Maybe there wasn't a product around, but it's just like, y'all should know each other. You're going to want to work together. Maybe you're not quite ready yet, but this is important. Or sometimes convening groups of people to have conversations about demand or supply, or just other issues that could be solved in the community. And then I won't read through each of these, but essentially these other roles have to do with procuring funding and helping getting funding to different folks in the value chain, helping to think about policy and where that's either supporting or hindering food systems development, providing technical assistance, especially market readiness is one of the top sort of ways that value chain coordination helps by getting suppliers and buyers market ready to work with each other. And also just in general, being an innovator and helping folks think out of the box. If you're in the business and you're a food supplier or a buyer, oftentimes you don't have the time to be creative, or you don't have the ability to take the risk to be creative. And so someone else who's doing the coordinating role can help maybe stimulate conversation about that. Now, my work was essentially for 3 years doing a study where I watched the investments take place, and I interviewed all the people that received the money, these coordinators, and I found out how this training impacted them and how it changed the way that they were doing their work in their own food systems. And actually, my research found that in addition to those roles, there were sort of a few additional roles, including facilitating accountability and negotiation, which is a difficult thing to get paid for, but is a huge part of what turns out what a lot of coordination professionals do. And also doing research was a really big piece of it. And not just convening stakeholders, but fostering relationships, which again, very difficult to explain that you're doing that work when you're just making these touch points. But these were some of the really important pieces that I thought were kind of missing in the initial articulation, but that I heard these coordination professionals speak about. And in addition, I just want to say that I found this pattern, and I don't know if it's helpful for anyone else, but the top line is sort of the primary roles of what I found that these coordinators were doing. That's essentially when they were writing a grant and saying, here's what we need the grant money for. they oftentimes listed these things. Everything on the bottom, they didn't usually like write grants and say, yeah, I'm here to do policy advocacy, or I'm here to foster relationships. That was all kind of the more invisible stuff that helped lubricate and get all the other primary roles done. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I just want to share that's at least one way I was thinking of the work. So with this, we actually have a little poll for you, because we are really curious in the room of all of you who are doing coordination work, which of these roles, maybe it's multiple, do you currently do right now the most? And we're going to launch this poll. And the thing is that it's in Whova.
Yeah, it's in Whova. You should be able, for those of you who are chiming in the Whova platform, go to the dashboard that you're logged into. And for those who aren't, we'll see if maybe we can lean on Malika to drop the link in there if that's the thing. There is a poll in Whova that you can select all that apply for. So get into your dashboard there. And let us know if you're having any issues.
And if you can't get into Whova, please in the chat right now, if you could just type in the top roles that you currently perform, we would just like to kind of take a pulse of the room. Who resonates with these roles and which ones do you do? Oh, and the poll, you can only make one selection, it says. Thank you for that. We're going to quickly try to fix that. In the meantime, use the chat and we will get the dialogue going. Oh, and our first answer is all. Okay. Yes. Seen that before. Brian too. Okay. Okay. It looks like there's no multi-option. So if you're in Whova, do the one that is your top one, the one that you do the most. If that resonates with you, if that doesn't resonate with you, use the chat and share. Which of these roles do you perform? Oh my gosh, we have so many folks who are doing all. Okay, so some are saying all, but then in specific or a primary, coordinating meetings, matchmaking, convening, especially market matchmaking, everything except market matchmaking.
And in Whova, it looks like the primary responses for folks are fostering and maintaining relationships seems to be a front runner, as are innovating and catalyzing new ideas and policy advocacy, which is exciting.
So I'm going to just say here that on this topic of roles, and as Ellie and Elizabeth from the Wallace Center mentioned, this is a short course, and we are going to be doing the expanded value chain coordination course as a full cohort over a series of 2 months in the winter. We will be spending so much more time getting into the nuance of what each of these means. And for example, even what does it mean that so many of the roles that you all are talking about, most people don't even get paid to do? We have a whole area to talk about how this work gets funded and which roles get funded and how. But because we don't have that time right now, what I just want folks to sort of sit with is the diversity and breadth of the skill that it takes to do this work. This is complicated work and these roles are diverse and various. And I'm actually really surprised to see a lot of folks saying all. And I just take a breath for a moment and think about all that you are holding when you look at the complexity of those roles. And as those are coming in, I'd like to move us forward a little bit on some other sort of things that I think are important to think about how this work gets done, who does it, and what for. So, as I mentioned, the work of the initial investment of FoodLink was really piloting this idea of giving funding to single organizations or people in these regions to do the connecting work, including all of those roles. And in my research, in talking to the folks who received this funding, I found actually that most often in a particular state or region, even though those who received the funding had a really big role to play, they were never the only ones performing all of those roles for that region. Maybe it was a food systems coordinator hired by a city who received the food link funding, but their work would have been impossible without the partnerships they had with Extension or their land grant university to make relationships to farmers. Or maybe it was a food hub that received the funding in their particular state to do the work, but their work would have been impossible without their partnerships with the Economic Development Corporation or some of the other policy folks at the county level who were helping them as thought partners. So what I'd like to suggest from sort of the first sort of iteration of what I think we've learned from investing in this work is that very infrequently is there a single coordinator to do all of the work. And what I think is a more helpful way of thinking about this work is not that there's one coordinator to do everything and have literally 10,000 arms, but rather if we think about these roles as roles that need to take place in a value chain or in a community, and if we think about the roles that need to be covered, we can think about the folks who are doing it as the professionals, the coordination professionals, those are the individuals that work in coordinating organizations, and hopefully that work together with other individuals and organizations to make sure that all these roles are covered, to build relationships, to create added value, to ultimately bolster prosperity for individuals, businesses, chains, economies in the places that these activities are taking place. Which brings me to another piece of terminology that I'd like to introduce. And some of you may be familiar with this and some may not. But I'd like to suggest that of all of the different kinds of actors in a food system landscape, that it's helpful to think about them in buckets, in at least two buckets. One, just looking at the transactional actors, that's anybody who's buying or selling something. So do you have something for sale? Are you buying it and selling it? You're probably a transactional actor. You're moving something. So input, supply, producing, processing, distributing, retail, that's a transactional actor. Everybody else in the food system is in a support ecosystem. There's support actors, including nonprofits, advocacy groups, extension, local government, and so on. These are individuals who oftentimes want to know what's happening in the transactional chains in their region, and they have services to offer. And it's important to recognize that both of these kinds of players are critical in building soft infrastructure. So one of the questions is, if we're using this term of value chain coordination, who's coordinated? Typically, one way we think about coordination is sort of horizontally. We're coordinating like buyers and suppliers, for example. So it's horizontal linkages across the chain. But a really critical dimension that sometimes can be lost in value chain coordination that is equally important is these linkages to and from the support actor. So if you're doing coordination work, it's really important to think about these two dimensions of connecting businesses to each other, as well as support to businesses, support to organizations who want to help them, and vice versa. Now the question is, who's doing the coordinating? In the research that I've seen, and in particular from the investments in FoodLink, it's both. So, and in fact, there's strength in it being in both. And we can, in our longer course, we will go into some more of the nuance of why. But just from a very sort of basic perspective here, typically, if you're in the middle of the value chain, those are the kinds of actors that most often are doing value chain coordination work. So it's not that a farmer couldn't do the work, it's just that they often don't, because it's not really their position in the chain. They're not usually between a whole lot of folks. And also that's just not their purview. But oftentimes processors, distributors, buyers, and retailers are the ones, transactional actors, doing this work. And in support actors, local governments might have a food systems coordinator, extension might have food systems coordinators for certain regions, nonprofits might be doing the coordinating work. And so the answer really here is it's kind of any and all. Now the reflection piece is, where are you in this landscape? Are you a support actor, or are you a transactional actor? Or are you some interesting hybrid of both? I don't typically see that, but it's possible that that's something, especially if you are a producer and maybe also have another job, for example, like with extension or something like that. Woo, we're not going to see you tomorrow yet. That was a sneaky. We're going to take a moment here and answer a few questions. It looks like some have come through the chat. Brian, I want to give you because you have your hand up, the mic, and then we'll answer some questions that have come in the chat about what we've just unpacked of this history and terminology.
Thank you, Sarah. I just wanted to, I guess, kind of ask a question. Thinking back a couple of years ago at NESOG conference where we did that value chain mapping exercise with Post-it notes and things, that was really pretty cool. And I actually use that a lot. So I think of it in terms of this context, isn't it important, let's say these 4 businesses, that you also think about what their infrastructure is like, what other businesses have to support the producer, right? They need equipment, they need seed, and processors, what do they need? And then also you can get into what the labor is like for the food processing. Is it equitable labor? Is it fair labor? Making the decisions of working with these businesses. How do you see that as that important, or is that just getting too much in the weeds?
I don't think there's anything so much as too much in the weeds. This work is systems work and layered. And I'd say whatever is on your radar as someone doing coordination as a potential barrier or opportunity is on the table. And
Okay.
just, Brian, also to reference the mapping exercise that you're talking about. So at NESOG, let's think, what year was that? Was that 2019?
I think so.
Yeah, at NESOG 2019, some of the folks from the WealthWorks were here. Actually, it was Melissa Levy, gave a free short course on the WealthWorks model to value chain, developing wealth building value chains. And that was offered, and Brian and I were in that class. I'm not sure if you can raise your hand if anyone else was there as well for that. And again, as we know from our history lesson earlier today, WealthWorks is not just a model that's rooted in food. They do food, they've done food work. They also work in a lot of other kinds of industries, which is a really cool feature of that training. And this actually maps on to Justin's question in the chat of, I remember the mention of demand actors. That's actually the WealthWorks model, where in addition to support and transactional actors, they break out a particular subcategory of transactional actor as demand, because in their model, they suggest that really all coordination, wealth building coordination should start with demand, and you should be creatively working backwards from demand. We're not here to necessarily promote one right nuance of the strategy at this point. We can have those conversations, and we will have those conversations more in our in-depth course. But to Justin's point, yes, some models of the strategy of this work also really, really call out, especially demand partners. And their work is fabulous, and they are also thought partners with us on this curriculum program. So we really respect and honor the work that they've done. And we're just trying to give kind of an overarching view and let you all decide a little bit the strategies that work best for you.
I want to point to a question that came through a little bit a while back. There's 2 particularly from Karen and Tracy here. One is from Karen, how could you do this work well without a background in farming and ranching, and the impact on the earth and community being involved in your scope? And should that person or somebody with that input and experience be on the team for value chain work? That's something let's hold that. And I think we're going to talk about that shortly here. And Tracy asked a really important question, which is, as value chains work to better consider and hopefully center racial equity as a primary value, do you see a shift in those roles that are presented here, and or an addition of a role that supports that specific value? I'm keen to hear from the audience as well. What does that make you think? Is there room for a separate role in your mind, or does the work itself sort of shift to accommodate or to focus and center racial equity?
So I'm also just going to lift up a couple of other questions that are coming in because there's some really great ones and I don't want to miss this. First, just a comment about being a food systems futurist. I've never heard that term, but that sounds awesome. Feel free to say more about that, by the way, in the chat. To coordinate and strategically influence interactions across all levels. I just want to point out here to build on that point. I think sometimes the point of this slide actually is to talk about the criticalness of doing coordination work at multiple levels. That's what changes it from being a food chain coordinator to a food systems coordinator. And oftentimes, let's be real, you're also usually working in multiple chains, depending on how you sort of slice and dice the work. And tomorrow we're going to get a lot more into the strategy exactly of how coordination professionals sort of bound their work and say, yes, I'm working on this, but no, I'm not working on that. Which is very difficult when you do systems work to finally say, I got to put blinders on and stop somewhere. But I just want to really drill that point that our other participant is making here. This work doesn't happen unless you work vertically and horizontally, unless you make connections across the chain and to the support. That is inherently the foundation of systems work. So thank you for that. And I'm so sorry about my little jumpy cursor here. We're not letting you off that soon. Another question that came in here, what would it look like instead of starting with / working backwards from demand? We started with and worked backwards from an equitable process and outcomes within the value chain. Elizabeth, thank you for just offering an approach, because I think what we're here to say as trainers right now in kind of the history and the meta is we're not comfortable being prescriptive and telling people where they should start with, but what we are comfortable with is holding the space to talk about what are the strategies that folks are currently doing and how could we do it better. And I think your point, Elizabeth, is a really beautiful articulation of what would it look like, and is this maybe a better way to do the work where we don't start with what's the demand for the thing, but what's the demand for the outcome that we all want to see, like healthy food access in our community or something else. So if you'd like to come off mute and say a little bit more about that, you're welcome, or anyone else can tag in to that really nice comment.
I guess I'm looking at this slide here and looking at, just these images symbolizing producer, distributor, buyer, retailer, all of that, and just thinking about like who owns the power in each of these facets of the value chain. And if, Elliot, I think your description of shifting power was really right on, but it feels like there must be an analysis of where that power is inequitably concentrated to talk about how we really shift power through value chain coordination work.
It's almost like there's a second day of this training.
Thanks for setting us up on that.
I'm going to offer to, I see Annie, you got your hand up there. I definitely want to make time for that. In the same way that Sarah's pointing to the notion that there's working across this sort of line of transactional support actors, many of the questions that folks are pointing to here are asking about, okay, but what about the, where in this role or in these roles do we see something that focuses squarely on shifting that power? Is it a role in and of itself to focus on racial equity? I would also offer that in value chain coordination work, in addition to thinking horizontally and vertically, there's a Z-axis here. There's a third dimension where we need to be thinking internally and externally, sort of a within and without approach, wherein the work isn't being done fully if you aren't examining from your internal whole integral self what's happening, how that what impact it's having on your own personal existence, as well as the interpersonal existence of those around you and the institutional work. So we're going to cover that a lot more in detail and hopefully have a much richer conversation with more time tomorrow. But just think, as we're talking horizontal and vertical, think Z-axis, whatever the words are there as well. But maybe Annie, we can take your comment here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I put a couple of things in the chat, and I just wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit on that. And I want to credit, where credit should be going to, which is to the incredible Ricardo Salvatore of the Union of Concerned Scientists, because it was his presentation at the 2019 Young Farmers Convergence that quite literally like burnt the house down around me and just completely shifted how I am facing and addressing and discussing these things. And, you know, he made a very clear and a very simple point, which is, you know, all of our agricultural systems began through exploitation and, you know, basically theft and, you know, that sort of thing. And, you know, we can't make progress without addressing that and without, you know, face first head on, you know, inverting that. And so in that spirit, that's why I respond that leadership must have an equity priority and focus. And all of this needs to start with an equity and priority focus in everything. And we have to intentionally, and just as intentionally as we enslaved individuals and, you know, use their bodies and the land for hundreds of years, we need to make that same intentional effort to those who have power currently have to acknowledge that and intentionally divest themselves of that and intentionally invest others who are historically have been disinvested in, which means, you know, investing in and supporting leadership that is diverse, that is, you know, minority, female, you know, things like that, that are, I mean, a lot of research and studies have shown how significant the disparity is between the opportunities afforded to, you know, for example, women of color, and the amount of work or, you know, exploitation that they're responsible for. And that has to be inverted if we're going to see, you know, a change in the way that things are happening.
Thank you. We've got time for one more conversation, then we're going to break into small groups and go a little bit deeper. So Karen, if you have a short comment, you can actually, you know what, there's someone else who hasn't raised their hand. Julie. Karen, if it's okay, would you mind if we give Julie airtime because she has not had a chance to speak? And Julie, we'll let you have the last comment before we go into some breakouts and unpack this deeper.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate creating this space to have this conversation. And I guess I was thinking about the question that Elliot asked around like, where does the work live, and like who, you know, how can it be most effective? And I guess so my background's in sustainability, and I was thinking a lot about how that industry has really grown, that space of practitioners, and how it used to be kind of this separate thing, right? And now it's embedded throughout organizations. And I guess I was thinking about how it had to really start by having, you know, people driving that work and being leaders in that space. And then it went from being a nice to have to a need to have. And I think a lot about both, I guess, the racial equity piece, but also just this soft infrastructure and the value chain coordination, and even just having language to describe it is super important, and being able to advocate to the economic, environmental, and social value of that, and making that case depending on who you're speaking with, right? You can't always lead with racial equity depending on your audience, but it's important that we as practitioners understand that importance to, you know, what Annie just was describing. So I think just creating these spaces and ensuring that all of us who are working in this space understand like that we're using shared language and understanding how to value that work. And I wonder if, you know, sustainability perhaps could be a model, right? This is now embedded at top C-suite levels, right? You have like chief sustainability officers. You also have, you know, chief DEI or JEDI, right? So I just wanted to share that as a thought. And also just, I really love the language around soft infrastructure and value chain coordination. And I hope that we continue to use this within food systems work and value. It's important as its own distinct role.
Julie, thank you for that comment. And it's actually a really beautiful segue into our breakout session that we're going to do. We have about 10 minutes, and we, to your point about the importance of getting on the same page sort of around some of the language and the framing so that we can start to have these difficult conversations. We'd actually like to have breakouts, and we're actually just only going to break the group into 2, but that'll give us a little more sort of nuance. Elliot and I will both be in a room. I'm putting the questions here that we're going to chat about for about the next 10 minutes in the chat. And it's just to kind of reflect on like, whoa, we've had a lot of definitions and terminology thrown at you in the past 90 minutes. Let's just sit for a moment and try this on for size and unpack this with each other a little bit deeper. So the 2 main questions here are, where are you currently positioned in the food system? Do you see yourself in the transactional sort of actor or as a support actor? And then depending on where you are, there's nuance to the work. And so we have a couple of little prompt questions here for you to just think about and also unpack with your group. Feel free in any remaining time to talk about some of these other sort of meta issues that are coming up. I think they're important. And we're giving you 10 minutes and then we'll come back and debrief all together. So with that, Elliot is going to send us to rooms and we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah, Elliot, you coming through?
Great, there we go. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. And we'll get the text broadcast back through here because that was a lot of information in the last chat. Let me find and copy it. Oh,
Elliot, real quick, this actually isn't breakout room 1. This is folks that haven't accepted the prompt to move into the breakout room yet. So
I thought I clicked join. My bad. I'll do that now.
no problem. And the rest of y'all, if you see an invitation to join either breakout 1 or 2, you just click accept. You will be sucked into that Zoom-verse.
Sorry, this is Leah. I didn't see or receive an invitation. Is it possible to resend that?
Yeah, let me see.
Maybe I missed it.
Yeah, huh. Let's see if I move you. Yeah, you're supposed to be in room 1. I'm gonna try and move you to room 2 and see if that works.
Thanks.
Yeah, and, well, don't think me yet. Let's see, did you get it?
No. And I'm pressing the join breakout room thingy on the bottom and it's not letting me do anything.
Well, it wouldn't be a Zoom training without a little technical difficulty. Let's see, I am not quite sure how to solve for this particular problem. Do you want to stay here and maybe this group and anyone else that is actually at their computers, we can have a little conversation amongst ourselves?
Sure, maybe if I leave and come back in.
Welcome to try that as well, yeah.
Hi, it just says, please wait to be assigned.
Okay, I need just a minute and then I will try one more time and see if we can get it.
Oh, yes, thank you.
I just did it, yeah.
Thanks, Ellie.
Uh-huh.
So many questions. Hey, Chris, and anyone else here in this main room, we are in breakout rooms right now. You should see an invitation to join a breakout room.
Yeah, it's Nagisa. I didn't see one either.
Okay, let's see.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. This is the way of Zoom. For folks just joining, we're in breakout rooms, having a quick brainstorm conversation. We are having a little bit of trouble with folks joining rooms. I'm gonna try and get y'all into breakout rooms for the remainder of the conversation.
Oh, thank you.
All right, I was just saying, folks just joining, I'm moving you into breakout rooms. Hopefully this should work.
All right, it looks like we made some progress. Oh,
Angel, are you able to join?
he might have stepped away. Oh, good news is this is recording right now.
Well, that's how we can edit. I see your message, Angel. Thank you. Totally get that. We can just hang out here until they come back. Hey, for anyone just joining, we are in breakout rooms right now. We're going to give it a couple more minutes, and then everyone's going to come back to the main rooms. Just hold tight.
It's always so humbling to be cut off right in the middle of the tech wizard, tech wizardry. I was that person in my group.
You were on a roll too.
Thank you. There was some amazing things that were being said, and I was just trying to reflect them back, but it was so powerful that I didn't even have time to do it.
Same. Yeah, never enough time.
But with that, we actually have a few minutes right now to just for groups to share what came up. And Brian, you want to say, Brian Sobel, do you have something to say? Your box is lit up. It just made me think that you had a recap to share from your small group breakout.
Oh, no, I mean, I think I was just, yeah, you got cut off in the middle. I was making a comment about that. But I don't need to take the airspace at this point. I mean, I think there was a lot going on. This has just been a lot to think about, a lot to take in. But yeah, I mean, I think these are all systems, and we need to be putting equity in front. It'd be nice if it could just be so seamlessly integrated into the work we do, but we live in a racist society where the systems are based on racial oppression, and we got to put it front or it won't be given the space that it needs. So yeah, that's just sort of my reflection on that conversation, which was great.
Yeah, just to uplift that even more, two of our folks, and I won't say your names, but you're welcome to raise your hand if you'd like to take attribution for this. Two of the folks in our group were talking about the importance of, in that educating role, really educating your stakeholders about the importance of what racial equity is and why it's a priority. So that was one piece that came up. And another kind of sort of meta conversation was reflecting on the historical definitions of value chain coordination and maybe having taking the time to creatively now articulate a definition that really centers equity in a more front and forward way, and also the systems nature of this work. And I'll let anyone else from my group in a minute. Rosalind, do you want to say more to that? And you're on mute, Rosalind. So
okay, it's Rosalind. I just wanted to say that Tracy's comment and your emphasizing the idea of education, dealing with equity with other groups, especially when I look at who we are, most of us or many of us here do not belong in an identity way with those groups, is that is a really complex issue that obviously society is dealing with now in general. And I think it will take, I think it's tricky. Even those of us that have been working in this area for a long time, it's still tricky, but needs our utmost attention as much in agriculture as in all of the other areas of social interaction. So I just wanted to stress that. If it made any sense.
It does. And actually, one of the points that I think we just want to keep iterating is that this is a sort of crash course primer in value chain coordination. And what we're quickly getting ourselves into is some of the nuance of how equity work is advanced. And I'd like to ask if anyone has resources, maybe even other sessions that are happening at NESOG right now, or other resources to help give the next steps of how we start to have, where and how we can get the training and have those conversations deeper. Please put them in the chat. I mentioned in our group that this is why we have a national community of practice for value chain coordination, which Elizabeth and Ellie referenced and dropped in the chat in the beginning of our session. I'm going to ask them to do the same, because these are the kinds of conversations that don't get answered in a 20-minute discussion. They are an ongoing process. It's also why we have a deeper course, and it's also why deeper courses in equity work exist. And this is the beginning of articulating that need, not the place where we have all the answers. So thank you for putting in some of those. The other group, I just want to give a minute to.
I just want to point to, if I can name you, Tazy, to just share briefly, your comment I think resonated with folks, which is in the course of the conversation, support actors saying, hey, here's something that we do, and Tazy in this case, in our group bedroom saying, hey, that's what I need. So Tazy, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I forget, was it Brian from, do you have a different background now? Did you move? It looks different. From Extension was saying how what they all have in their region is a lot of like a systems view of this work. And I was saying, I feel like, I don't know, I mean, we do have those conversations and there's lots of like meetings and groups and everything, but where I am in New York City, I think that's still lacking, even though we have a lot of like technical systems providers and alliances and networks. I think it could still be kind of like next level up.
Yeah, that's awesome. Always more.
One more minute for other reflections, especially from the other group, from the group that Elliot was in.
Anybody, maybe Brian, you want to share anything else, or maybe Justin, since you spoke as a transactional actor, anything?
Okay.
Cool.
Well, otherwise we're going to start to bring us. Okay, sorry, there's a lag on our end, so we didn't mean to cut you off. Brian, go ahead, please.
Well, you're quite far away. That's the no, I was just going to say, I think Sarah has a whole presentation on why Extension needs to be involved in this kind of work, because for the most part you don't have to pay for it, which has always been the trouble. Is everybody sees that you need, somebody has to do this work, but trying to build that into those transactional relationships is impossible, basically. So, you know, the more that something like a land grant university or Extension in particular can take advantage, I mean, can work in these realms, it brings a lot of tools and knowledge to the table that we can then make those partnerships happen and those relationships happen, the main thing.
Thank you, Brian. And I think that's a good place to help us come to a stopping point for today, knowing that we've got day 2 tomorrow. So I just want to take a step back. For example, we just finished day 1, the crash course in foundations of value chain coordination. And I just want to recap what we just filled in our brains in the past almost 2 hours, which is sort of in addition to meeting each other, and having a huge group today, by the way, so thank you for your attention. We heard about some of the historical definitions of the concept of value chain. We learned about the concepts of hard and soft infrastructure, or were reminded of those. We covered the history of the investment in hard and soft infrastructure in local and regional food systems, focusing on the Food Link program and unpacking some of the roles of value chain coordination. And I'm asking the questions of, in this work, where is power and equity nested? And we've had some really rich conversations about the work that needs to be done and different strategies of moving that forward. We've also talked about support and transactional actors and the way that sort of the roles are different with that. And that's a lot to sit with all in one day. And so we just want to honor the attention and focus that took. And thank you for starting some of these conversations. And for tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit more about the way that you can develop value chain coordination as a collaborative strategy, because we fundamentally believe this work doesn't happen in a vacuum and alone. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and get to the activity of actually mapping value chains with the dimensions of power that we started to talk about today.
I know we're right at the hour here, but we're going to rapid fire 3 things. 1, show of hands who's used the platform Mural to do live whiteboard activities at a collective. Show of hands if you're familiar with Mural. A few, maybe not a ton. Okay, good to know. Hold the question of the caliber and quality of the relationships that you have in this work as you come to our conversation tomorrow. That came up often over and over and over again. So hold what it means to be in good relationship with somebody. And then last but certainly not least, Elizabeth from the Wallace team has a couple of things to share. So go for it, Elizabeth.
Super quick, y'all, this was awesome. As I mentioned in the intro, this is only the 2nd time this has ever been done. And so this is a learning and iterative process here. think we're already learning a lot together. So your feedback is super, super important as we continue to mold this together. So session 2 is tomorrow, 11:45 Eastern, but for anyone that can't make it, I went ahead and put in the survey evaluation. It's 9 questions, mostly yes or no. Doesn't take long. If you know that you're not going to be here tomorrow, please go ahead and share your feedback this way. Just skip the first 2 questions. Otherwise, hold off and fill it out at the end.
Elliot and I will stay on for a few minutes longer if anyone has any comments. Otherwise, we thank you for your attention and we really look forward to sharing tomorrow with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
So Malika from NISOG, if you have any things for us, tech stuff, you can stop the recording. And if there's anything you'd like to go over for day 2, we'd be happy to chat about that right now as well.